This is Jay Callahan again. Welcome back. Um, Today we're going to talk about dissociation. I mentioned that in the last video mini lecture that dissociation is one of the symptom clusters of traumatic stress, and I wanted to save talking about it to a separate video because it's confusing and weird, and a lot of people don't understand it. And I don't understand it. At least I didn't until it happened to me, and I'll get to that later, probably in a different video. But I had one major dissociative episode in my life when a client got the drop on us with a gun, drop on my outreach partner and myself, a police officer and his family. Let me say right off the bat that nothing bad happened. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got shot. But when that happened in the client's home and he got the drop on us with a shotgun, I had a dissociative episode. So anyway, I will tell you about that later. But right now, I want to just talk about the concept of dissociation to kind of set the stage so you would understand that. And as I mentioned, dissociation is weird. People don't understand it very well. It's definitely part of acute stress disorder, and it may or may not be part of post-traumatic stress disorder. So what's the definition? Well, the DSM definition, bear with me here. Dissociative disorders are characterized by a disruption or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. Now that's a mouthful, but the essence of it is normally our consciousness is, we have a normal state of consciousness. We appreciate the world. We can take in the world. We have access to our memory of what's happened recently, what's happened in the past. We are clear about our own identity. Our emotions are available to us, even though some people, and some of us maybe, don't always understand exactly what we're feeling. We have access to them. And similarly with these other aspects, motor control, we move our bodies and we feel fully in control of moving our bodies, right? And control of our behavior. Well, dissociation is a disruption in that. When people feel that, for example, their consciousness is altered, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What do I mean altered? But a change in the perception of the passage of time, for example. We'll come back to that. Or memory is disrupted with amnesia and people can't remember aspects of what happened. Or their perceptions change in terms of how the world looks, or they feel even sometimes outside of themselves, watching themselves. All these kind of things are examples of dissociation. Now there are, as you can see from this definition, there are specific dissociative disorders, and we're going to not talk about that all that much. But the concept of dissociation, as it is a part of acute stress disorder or PTSD, and really as it's a part of traumatic stress, is what we're concerned about here. Now, another definition of dissociation is an experienced loss of information or loss of control over mental processes that normally are subject to direct control or self-attribution. We feel like we are experiencing our consciousness and the events around us, or we feel like we are in control. This is a disruption of that, where things don't feel like they're under our control, or that our awareness has changed, or whether we're in control or not has changed. Now I know this doesn't seem very clear what it could be. What does this mean? So maybe my own example will help you understand that. Actually, specifically, there are kind of two most concrete examples that the DSM talks about, and that's depersonalization and derealization. So depersonalization, as you can see here on the slide, is when a person feels unreal or disconnected from themselves, from their own body, from their own self. So experiences of unreality, things they don't seem real to themselves. They feel detached from themselves. They feel like they're an outside observer of their own thoughts or feelings or sensations. And in extreme cases, this is when people have out-of-body experiences where they feel like they're standing 6 or 8 feet away over there and they're watching themselves. I had a client one time tell me that she was in an auto accident, and in the immediate aftermath of the accident, she kind of was confused about what happened, and she didn't know what was going on, and she found herself looking at her car, and then she got out of her car. And it took her a second to realize what was happening, that she was, in her mind, somehow, she was observing herself get out of the car. And it only lasted a few seconds, and her consciousness and her body kind of reunited again. But for 15 or 30 seconds there, she felt like she was outside of her body watching herself. Okay? And an important point of this, and this is also from the DSM, is the person has intact reality testing. That is, at the same time, they know that this can't be real, that this isn't happening, that they know that they're not outside of their body. They know that the disconnect about the bodily sensations is not real, that they are, in fact, inside and experiencing their own body's experience. But it's the feeling of discontinuity or disconnection. And the other example is derealization. And this is very similar, except that it's the world seems unreal. The world seems detached. It seems dreamlike. It seems foggy. It seems like a flat painted backdrop, a few people have told me, like a movie set. But at the same time, as we said a minute ago, the person has intact reality testing. They know it's not true. They're not psychotic. They're not disconnected from reality in any major way, but it feels that way. It seems that way. Right? A couple other terms that are helpful here that are part of dissociation. Peritraumatic dissociation. So peritraumatic means during the traumatic event. And peritraumatic dissociation would be dissociation during the event. Persistent dissociation would be dissociation that begins during the event but continues after the event is over. So peritraumatic is simply during the event, persistent continues afterwards. Now some of you, well, that might be before your time. In 1989, I believe it was, there was a fairly major earthquake in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And you may have seen pictures about this later. This was the earthquake in which an expressway, a double-decker expressway, collapsed on itself for a period, for a space of maybe a mile or so. And unfortunately, there were a number of people who were killed or trapped because they were driving in the road underneath the upper deck of this expressway. And when the upper deck collapsed on the lower deck of this expressway, it didn't smush all the way down. There was about a 4-foot gap that was being held up by some pieces of concrete and cars and all kinds of things. Remember, this is a piece of expressway that goes on for a mile or so. And it became clear to the passersby, and especially to the police and first responders, that even though the cars in the lower roadway might have been crushed, still they were not crushed down flat, and there might be some survivors, and in fact there were. And so some rescue teams were quickly put together, again made up of police, first responders, and California transportation workers. And they, remember, it's about 4 feet. There's about 4 feet of room, and they crawled in to see if they could find any survivors, which, as I said, they did. Now, so researchers in the Bay Area were able to interview these rescuers in the immediate aftermath of the rescue, and they were in there, different groups that were in there for periods of time, but it was an hour or two. And keep in mind, after an earthquake there are aftershocks. So while these rescuers are crawling around in this collapsed expressway, there's aftershocks and everything shakes, and there's the very real danger that the upper deck will fall further down and crush the rescuers, which fortunately didn't happen, but they really took their life in their hands in this rescue operation. You have to admire people for doing that. But my point of the story is that when these rescuers and first responders were interviewed by the interviewers, the academic interviewers later, many of them, I can't remember the proportion, but a significant number of them, not all, reported aspects of dissociation. That is, they felt like it wasn't real, that this wasn't really happening, that they weren't really there, and that there were people who said that time dramatically slowed down, and that they felt disconnected from themselves and disconnected from what was going on around them, which, as I understand it, in most cases ended when they came out of the danger area. But those are examples of peri-traumatic dissociation. Okay, whoops. Now, the other thing I want to mention about dissociation is that traditionally dissociation has been defined as and perceived as a psychodynamic defense mechanism. And that makes some sense. It's as if our identity, our consciousness, in some cases can't handle the full enormity of what has happened to us. And so we separate out part of it and we kind of wall it off, or we put it over there, or we push it away, and we only experience as much as we can handle. So it becomes a protective mechanism that way, a defense mechanism, in order for people to be able to experience the horrible event that just happened to them. Now, if that's true, and again, that's the traditional view of dissociation, then it presents a problem, because if that were true, you would expect that the people who experience dissociation, as opposed to those who do not, should fare better in the long run. They should have less, maybe a lower percentage of people that develop PTSD, or simply a lower proportion of people who continue to have difficulty later on. But in fact, it's the other way around. It turns out that of the people who, after a traumatic event, of the people who experience dissociation tend to do worse than the people who are in the same event but who don't experience dissociation. And so that's then the idea about calling it a marker of distress. And in fact, probably the leading candidate, it hasn't worked out fully, but for quite a while, the leading candidate for a symptom to look for early on in the first few weeks after a traumatic event, which would tend to try to predict who's going to continue to struggle, who's going to end up having PTSD later on, are the people who have dissociation. Now, it turns out that to some extent that still is true, but it's not a really good way to differentiate who's going to do well and who isn't going to do well. But you can see the idea of it being a marker of distress. Now, I also want to mention to you another way to look at dissociation, and I think this one's maybe a little easier to keep in mind in some ways, and so I have like 4 levels of dissociation. The simplest and the most common is dissociation of emotion. So this is, and again, like most examples of dissociation, this happens in the aftermath of trauma. Dissociation is almost inevitably connected up with trauma. So again, the most simple example is lack of emotional response or emotional numbness, and this is very common. You hear it all the time. Somebody's brother dies, and someone else asks them, well, how are you feeling about that? And they say, well, I don't know. I don't feel anything right now. I feel numb. I don't feel anything. So in the aftermath of a death, for example, it's very common for family members to feel kind of numb and disconnected from their feelings for a few days or a few weeks even after the death has happened. So this is a very common and kind of ordinary example, in this case, of dissociation of emotion. Secondly is dissociation of consciousness, how we experience the world. And this kind of ties in with what we talked about a minute ago about depersonalization and derealization. It can also be described as people feeling spaced out or zoned out, that they have feelings of unreality. Things don't just seem real. They look the same, but they look different, like a flat backdrop, as I mentioned. That they have an altered sense of time. Time slows down. Usually time slows down. Sometimes time speeds up. And finally, if they've been physically injured, they typically don't feel any pain. This is the experience itself of being disconnected and spaced out. A third kind of dissociation is dissociation of memory, and this is amnesia, partial or complete amnesia for the traumatic event that just happens. There's a caution here, however, and that is there are many cases of traumatic stress when people have suffered physical injuries, and amnesia is often a side effect of a concussion or a head injury. So it's important to keep in mind that head injury is more common the cause of memory loss, then dissociation is the cause of memory loss. If someone with a head injury due to a traumatic event has amnesia for part or all of that event, then the likelihood is that it was caused by the physical injury and not dissociation. And then finally, the most severe kind of dissociation is dissociation of identity. And this tends to be chronic. This can go on for years and years. And this is primarily dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. It's not really multiple personality disorder. It's a person has shards of one personality, split off from each other. And to some extent, that's why it was renamed dissociative identity disorder. But, people have main identities. They have alter identities that they go in and out of. They lose time when they're in their primary identity for what goes on when they're in their alters. And this can go on for decades or a lifetime, and is almost always caused by childhood physical or sexual abuse. Another example, less chronic, is dissociative fugue. And this is the dissociative amnesia, but coupled with flight, physical flight away from the scene of the traumatic event. This was written about more commonly in World War I, in the trench warfare in France, where soldiers or unknown men would show up in a small French town, give a different name than their real name, take a job, and upon questioning not be able to remember anything prior to coming to that town. And it turns out that, of course, it was the trauma of wartime that led them to develop amnesia and then flee the scene. And then the reason this is listed under dissociation of identity is that they would take on a new identity. Now, this is quite rare. But there was an example written up in the New York Times recently, and I posted the New York Times article in the syllabus in Sakai for this example of a school teacher who actually had 2 episodes of dissociative fugue. Okay, but you can also see how these are kind of in a hierarchy of seriousness, from dissociation of emotion, feeling numb in the aftermath of a traumatic event, all the way up to losing one's sense of identity. Okay, one other related issue I want to bring up in this video is type 1 versus type 2 trauma. This was a distinction first raised some years ago by a child psychiatrist named Judith Herman. Excuse me, and it's the idea of differentiating chronic trauma from acute trauma. So type 1 trauma is a single event, the single freestanding event that happens to a child or an adult. Get into a car accident, get mugged, be sexually assaulted, be in an earthquake, or other kind of natural disaster, the single event. Type 2 trauma, on the other hand, is a series of traumatic events or continuous traumatic events that's in the context of physical or psychological captivity. So this basically means people who have been victims of childhood physical or sexual abuse, prisoners of war, people in concentration camps, some cases of domestic violence, and also comes to mind, some of the examples of young girls or teenage girls who are kidnapped by men who take them away and keep them captive. Over the last few years, there's been unfortunately a series of these that eventually come to light. Sometimes the girl is held captive for years. The kidnapper impregnates her, they have children, and sometimes often the girl grows into a woman and then finally escapes, and it comes to the attention of the authorities. This would be another example of type 2 trauma. And the main point of it is that, of course, it takes place in the context of captivity. Otherwise, as soon as the first traumatic event happened, their whole focus would be on getting away from that situation. So the person is held captive physically or is brainwashed and made to feel that they can't escape. And therefore, unfortunately, then they are subject to multiple or continuous traumatic events. Now, the implication of this, and why I bring it up now, is that when type 2 trauma, the victims are much more likely to have dissociation as a part of the symptomatology, and much more likely to have chronic disorders and difficulties. As you can imagine, would happen in a situation like that. So one take-home point is that crisis intervention is only appropriate for type 1 trauma, the single event. And that's because survivors of type 2 trauma are rarely in crisis, right? So you have to keep in mind, just because someone has a traumatic event doesn't mean we do crisis intervention with them. We do crisis intervention when someone's in crisis. Many people experience traumatic events and are resilient and do well and don't experience a crisis, don't have acute stress disorder, whatever. But those who do, it's ones who go into a crisis that we do crisis intervention. People with type 2 trauma, by the time we learn about them, or the authorities learn about them, the police or DCFS or whoever, almost always the victim has been in crisis, but now they settled into a new stability. And unfortunately, that new stability is a lower level of functioning. Sometimes that lower level of functioning can be appropriately given the label PTSD or complex PTSD. As I'll talk about later, after a crisis, which is self-limiting, people can't stay in a state of crisis forever, and that's where the 4 to 6 week business comes in. Sometimes people are unable to process and cope with the traumatic event and the meaning of the traumatic event in 4 to 6 weeks, and yet the crisis will come to an end, self-limiting, in that they will then settle into a new stability. They will no longer be in a state of psychological instability or emotional disequilibrium. They'll be in a state, a new stable state, but unfortunately it'll be at a lower level of functioning. I have a case example we'll talk about soon of a woman who suffered traumatic stress and settled into a lower level of functioning. And I have another case example we'll talk about of a group of SWAT officers that I think came out of a traumatic event. Again, a traumatic event where they were the rescuers. They were the first responders. They weren't the direct victims, but where they came out at a higher level of functioning afterwards. So then finally, just to say a little bit more about complex PTSD. This is not an official diagnosis. A group of clinicians and researchers have tried to get the DSM committees of the American Psychiatric Association to consider this as a separate diagnosis from PTSD, but they have been unsuccessful, not enough research, supposedly, blah, blah, blah. But complex PTSD is essentially the concept of the kind of consequences of type 2 trauma, continued or repeated trauma, which leads to the typical symptoms of PTSD, the typical symptoms of traumatic stress that we've been talking about, but in addition, even more pervasive symptoms such as emotion dysregulation, such as dissociation, like we've been talking about, alterations in their perceptions of themselves, distorted perceptions of the perpetrator, alterations in their relationships with other people, things like that. And to some extent, it resembles what we understand as borderline personality disorder. And there are certainly many researchers who would argue that borderline personality disorder is better conceptualized as complex PTSD. That is, a high proportion, not everybody, but a high proportion of people, especially women, with borderline personality disorder have been victims of childhood physical and sexual abuse, and that therefore the diagnostic label of PTSD fits better, and especially the diagnosis of complex PTSD fits better. All right, so this is also important kind of consideration in terms of traumatic stress and dissociation. I also wanted to mention, just in terms of dissociation, that when I do interview a client who has been through a traumatic event, and I ask them about many of these symptoms, I also make sure, and I think you need to make sure, to ask about dissociation, which is a little awkward because it's weird, right? But I think one way to do that is to say, now during this event or after this event, and I know you had, there was a lot going on, and did you ever have any kind of unusual experience or unusual perceptions or things that didn't seem real or really out of the ordinary? And if people have not had dissociation, they typically say, what? What do you mean? But if people have had dissociation, which again they may not have spontaneously mentioned, they may not think about it, and actually when we talk about it later, I'll mention how dissociation kind of protects itself, and people don't always even conceptualize it as anything weird. They just kind of forget about it and tuck it away in the background. But if you ask about it, they might be able to articulate what happened to them. All right. Well, thank you. This is our discussion about dissociation, and I'll be talking again with you soon.